Good morning. Good morning. So let's begin. My name is Stephen Onu. I'm a faculty member here at Harrisburg University. If you are a basketball fan, like I am, this is one of the best presentations. You are lucky to be here. Our speaker is Peter Wilhelm. Peter is a director in KPMG Experience Design and Engineering team. Peter has led project engagements from clients from varied industries, such as homeland security, automotive, retail, and support. His passion is really making sure that clients' strategic objectives are met. We are so privileged to have Peter here. Please join me in welcoming Peter to our university. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the warm introduction. In keeping things in the spirit of Agile, I'll just do a little program note. You might see that Dave Wolf was your speaker on the agenda this morning, but unfortunately he wasn't able to be here today, so I'm happy to be here in his place. Nice Agile promo, right? Anyway, so I'm happy to talk to you guys today about a project that I've been privileged to work on for the last couple of years. It's the NBA's game scheduling system. Started a couple years ago. They were looking to modernize the way they do schedule generation. They understand that there's a lot of software tools out there on the market that make this possible to do through computer technology. They were doing things by hand a lot. So we helped them put together a system that enables them to do that through the power of Hadoop clusters, and we'll get into that a little bit here. So I want to talk to you, start off with just quickly the agenda here. So we'll start by talking through the problem, what it is that they're trying to do, why it's important to engage a team like us to help them get through it. We'll talk through the approach. We'll get into the architecture a little bit. I want to kind of explain how our teams were structured. It's really driven by that architecture. We'll go through the design process, as well as our development process. These are both very agile. We're going to talk a little bit about how they're tied to processes and procedures that you're familiar with. If you've gone through Scrum training, you probably are familiar with that, but we're a little bit different from that. We kind of lean on the edge a little bit with that. And continuous integration, we'll talk through the tools that we use for that and why it's important to tool development when we're doing development like this. And I'll leave some time at the end for some Q&A. All right, so I'm going to start off with a video that I think tees up the problem pretty well. It explains what the NBA was trying to do and how we kind of help them with that.
My focus is on the game. It's a fantastic game, but there's aspects that I believe we can improve. Let me begin with scheduling.
They had the most back-to-backs in the league this year with 23.
They're in the midst of a brutal road trip, and they've been up and down throughout the season.
We have an incredibly grueling sport. Players play 82 games over the course of roughly 6 months, and they're constantly traveling from city to city to play those games.
There's nothing more important than the health and welfare of our players, and ultimately we want to see players getting appropriate rest and playing at the highest level.
The entire business of the league starts with the schedule. The schedule touches every part of what everyone in the league and the teams and their communities and their arenas and their fans focuses on. It's a lot of responsibility.
We had a meeting a few years ago, and what came to mind was the idea of transitioning from a manual approach to the schedule to a computer automated approach.
I thought this was a standard technology solution that could be purchased and solved with off-the-shelf software. And after digging in and really doing some research and speaking with some experts in the field, we recognized that this was something where we needed some assistance from a firm like KPMG.
If you just think about, all right, I'm a team, I've got 170 days where I could play a game, and I've got 82. Even the number of ways you can decide, all right, play, rest, play, rest, play, rest, whatever. There's more possibilities for that than there are grains of sand on a beach. It's shocking in a way.
We came across this concept called constraint-based optimization. And the idea behind it is that you can feed into a computer system all the things you want to achieve or avoid in any given schedule. and then you can assign relative penalty values to each of those things. The way this played out was we actually devised a test problem as part of our RFP process. And we said to each of the respondents, we'd like you to take our 2014-15 schedule and improve upon it. And KPMG's score came in close to 0.
Which is good.
We can also then go in and look at other choices like structural density. So where are we seeing back-to-back?
What was most unique about KPMG was their analytical solution to the problems.
You want a person and a machine to work together to solve the problem together. So it's a lot of working as a team, collaborating between the mathematicians, the designers, the developers, the teams at the NBA. There was no us and them. We were working as a team because at the end of the day, we all, in a way, became obsessed with it. How low can we get this score, and how much better can we do than what's been done for the past 30 years?
When looking at the overall solution, there's really two components to it. The optimization engine that does the heavy lifting, but then there's also the user interface that our internal business units have to work with. And really the ease of use, the intuitiveness, and the elegance of it really was accomplished by KPMG.
In year one only, we've been able to improve on the most important metrics to the league, which are the player health and wellness metrics. And we think there's even further room for improvement. We're really just getting our feet wet with this system.
You start to think about how many dimensions there are to the NBA scheduling problem, and as a mathematician, I'm thinking, well, geez, what other problems out there that are rich like this? There's so many other opportunities out there like that.
Great. So I hope that gives you a little bit of background on what the problem was and what what the task was that we're trying to solve for here. Like the video said, it's a very complicated problem. There's a lot of different constraints that go into coming up with the right schedule, the best schedule. Constraints come in the form of, the networks, the television networks that the NBA has contracts with have, their own requirements about what games they want to have on their, on their premium nights. The teams obviously have a lot of restrictions on when they're available. NBA in particular has arenas that they share sometimes with NHL teams. The arenas are not owned by them generally, so they have to also, host Miley Cyrus concerts or whoever the heck is, popular these days. And, the NBA themselves have a lot of different, requirements they're looking to improve, for the teams. The back-to-backs are very important, the 4 and 5s, things like that actually affect player health and performance in the game as a result. So, all of these kind of factors go into coming up with, the optimal schedule, right? But there's really no truly optimal schedule. Really what we're trying to do is search through billions of schedules, looking for ones that are least, violate the least number of violations on the schedule for all those constraints, factoring them all in, and trying to find one that's the best schedule, that gives them the best KPIs. So really, you can do that with by hand generation in some cases. Turns out the NBA problem is just too complicated for that. It really, it's just there's too much going on for you to make intelligent decisions about moving a game from one spot to another, or with a network, moving it from this night to another night so that it can be on ESPN. These are just things that just don't work very well with with manual moves because there's just too many things going on. That's not the case necessarily for all sports software or sports problems, but it is pretty difficult for NBA. There are commercial solvers on the market that do provide pretty excellent solutions. They drive towards the optimal, quote, optimal solution, which is great for when you have very well-structured problems. You have exactly what the priorities are between different constraints. If you're solving for something like that, then commercial solvers work really well. Turns out that's not really the case either for NBA because how do you determine whether something is exactly this much penalty, a penalty of 100 for the ESPN game, not being at the night you want it versus the teams, having to play an extra back-to-back. These are really kind of arbitrary decisions you're making at some level, right? You're trying to make that prioritization as best as you can make it, but it's kind of you're using people to make those decisions. So mixed integer programming is not quite right either. So what we did was we came up with a solution that uses heuristics on the back end in an optimization engine that we built that takes these constraints into consideration, lets them be weighted against each other, relatively, and the optimizer does its job to search through all these billions of schedules, comes up with which ones are working well, which ones are not. It's searching by moving, making little moves here and there, moving, comparing the schedules, and then eventually coming back with what it thinks is a good schedule. It scores that out, gives it back to the user, and then the user can make quick decisions about, does this look right? Sort of in the spirit of Agile also, right? We want to not wait until, sometimes commercial solvers can take days to come up with a solution. And maybe that solution is not great because you gave it the wrong parameters on the input, and so it might not be really what you want in the end at all. So our solution is more of a Agile. We're looking to, churn through a bunch of schedules, come up with ones that look pretty good, and give them to the user and let them make decisions about whether it's good or not. We do that through a user interface that makes it possible for the users from a variety of different, skill levels, I'll say, makes it easy for them to put put these constraints into the system. We call it natural language, natural sentences. Basically, it's just very simple. If I want to avoid having more than 5 back-to-backs for a team throughout through a certain part of the season, I write the constraint just that way. Avoid back-to-backs through date X to date Y. Makes it very easy for people that are not familiar with commercial solver technology to make it make powerful constraints part of the system. So that's all part of it's all web-based solution. We do everything that the user interface is all web-based. We do all the complex constraint calculation. We send that over to the optimizer. Optimizer's sitting in a Hadoop cluster that we run in AWS. And that makes it very easy to scale up and down when necessary. So during the crunch time of generating a schedule for the upcoming season, the NBA might need to, they start off with a certain number of clusters, and then they can ramp that up if they need to because they really want to be able to churn through a lot of different scenarios more quickly. So Hadoop and AWS are really good at doing that for us. Importantly, though, every schedule that comes back is measured on a number of different factors, right? So you saw in the video, back-to-backs are important, 4 and 5s are important. There's a lot of other factors, travel, total travel for the team, how many road trips they have, do the road trips look good, do they look bad? Fresh, tired, even is another metric of how well the team is rested compared to their opponent for each game. So these are all things that the teams are already calculating on their own. The NBA knows that. They calculate these things themselves too. We put that all in front of the user so that they can make that decision, is this a good schedule or not? And if not, make tweaks, right? Run it again. So the reason I wanted to talk about all that, though, is this is part of the Agile process for us, is that our team, my team, was responsible for the user interface. So we do all the design. We'll talk about the design and the development process for our side. So we did all the web and middle tier functionality. There was another team at KPMG that's got the math PhDs that were in the video, right? So they're a different team than us, but worked really well together for us. Is that we're different teams, but we work integrated with the same tool sets. Makes it very easy to collaborate well together. Another part about collaboration I'll talk about is that we're not all in the same location. Sometimes Scrum is looking for people to be co-located. Sometimes that works well, sometimes it doesn't when you're dealing with reality of where your people are. So actually we work really well together because of the collaboration tools and using IM and other methods to keep in touch with each other. So delivery tools. It's kind of dry maybe, but I think it's important because there's a ton of tools on the market. They all provide a lot of the same capabilities. I don't think it really matters too much which tools you select as long as they work well for you. For us, we use a lot of the tools that are on the slide, right? For different projects. For this one, like I mentioned, we're using well, I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but we're using Angular and Node for the web front end. We have SQL Server database. We have Hadoop cluster for the back end. Like I said, it all just kind of depends on what you need for your project. But in this case, we selected the tools that made sense for us. In terms of the delivery tools, I think the most important part there is that, again, there are a lot of tools that are out on the market that will let you do things like continuous integration. But I think what's important there is that they all if they are well integrated with each other, it makes for a lot smoother process. It makes things easier for delivery, makes it less likely to have quality issues because you're continuously seeing the results of your work. So I think whatever tools you select, make sure that they're well integrated. They allow for transparency, collaboration, and integration. So Agile and design. So I'm going to start with this slide. Really just kind of talks to our experience with user design. So we focused, my team works on user-centric design as a primary method for delivery of design or of development. So we start off with what is exactly, what is the user all about? Understanding those users, their motivations, their needs from the application, and trying to get to the point of designing something that actually serves them well. You'll see that the top part of that is just trying to say that you can do things a lot of different ways, again with tools, but in our experience, it's really easy to lose track of the work that you're doing. So we built a tool that helps us to create designs, put the designs in front of the users that need to provide comment on them, make sure that the feedback that we're getting is captured in one place. We can act on that, make sure that the activities are all resolved and that we're spitting out new versions of the design so that the users ultimately see exactly what they're about to get. So let me walk you through that a little bit. This top part is really just showing you, the tool that we built, Cycle, we call it, helps us with this. There's tools on the market also for this, but we just didn't feel like the ones that were out there were working well for us. So we built this one that allows us, the designers, to put together, our spotlights, working through wireframes all the way through initial designs, and organizing it into what you can see in the bottom right, this app hierarchy, so you can understand as a user, you're coming through and you're looking to see how is this going to be ultimately laid out in the application that we're building. It's all there for us. We can see it easily. It allows us easily also to, as developers, to pick up the pieces, right? So I've got Team Manager in the middle there. When I'm ready to implement the Team Manager functionality, these are all the designs that go with that, and I can quickly throw them together into design tasks on Jira. So here's an example of one of the designs, one of them that you saw in the video. You can see in this example that what we have is, let's see if my mouse works. Yep. So the designer is able to upload this design here for us, right? Then we can let the users of the system actually enter comments, right? So they can circle in here and say, give us direct feedback. I think that I have a question about this. Is this how it should work? The designer can write back and say yes or no. And then we can put in actions to make sure that someone is taking care of that to eventually get it into the user stories so that it's all implemented properly and that we have the testing on the back end to validate. Prototyping is another important part of design. I think this is really kind of critical actually, because what happens is you can build out all these lovely designs, but people aren't really thinking about how it's going to work until you developed it. And maybe it's not quite the way they expected it to be. So this is another aspect of this particular tool. Again, other tools can do it as well. Allows us to highlight hot spots on the screen, right in the designs, clickable areas. And then when we do our demonstrations for the client, we can say, all right, great. So this is what you see when you log in. If I click on this button, it's going to take you to this other view, and it'll actually navigate the user through each of those stages so that they can understand what's going to happen. They can actually. It's not the real world, right? It's not actually doing anything in code, but you can click on the thing. I can see my design for the drop downs fold out. I can see that when I click on something, that the plane in the middle, right? The plane is demonstrating our travel factors for that particular road trip. They can get a feel for how it's going to work, and they can give us feedback. Does it work or not? In this example, we have sort of the blue and red and gray coloring on the planes. That was part of the feedback that they gave us during one of those workshop sessions, is saying it really is important to us, and we didn't know this initially, even though we had a very long introductory session where we're gathering requirements and understanding their needs and everything. We didn't really understand the impact of just how painful it is for a team to have to go on road trips that involve crossing back and forth over time zones, just how hard that is because you're doing it back to back. Imagine you're going from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast, and then having to play there and then perform again on another, hitting another travel right after that. Like, it's very exhausting to lose all that time. So it's important for them to see that the users of this system who are evaluating, is this a good schedule or not? If I looked at this maybe at the beginning of the project, I probably wouldn't know, but you can kind of see that there's just too much going on, right? There's too much crisscrossing going on. So that's one factor that we use to determine whether this is a good schedule, but also it drove additional requirements for us in the end that said, all right, let's avoid that problem. How do we avoid that problem? So let's write constraints that can factor that problem out of the schedule. And eventually, you go through that a number of times, and you're getting to the point where you're actually generating schedules that don't look like that, or road trips that don't look like that. User story linkage, another important part of this tool and any others that you might use. There's a lot of little pink axes on the screen. This is a busy screen, right? There's a lot going on in this view. We've got controls at the top for controlling playback and providing information on flyovers and on the planes themselves. What do the dots mean? So all of that information is important to capture so that we're knowing how to implement it in design or in development. What we do is we create user stories for all of those different aspects. Anything that's important to telling the story of how we get from what the user needs to be able to do. And what's expected outcome, what are the acceptance criteria for that. So each of those pickaxes are representations of something where we click on this area of the screen, we highlight the area, the control that we're trying to talk about, we create a user story that talks about exactly what that behavior is supposed to happen, what's supposed to happen with that control. So we can track that through, and this is all linked in our system anyway, it's linked automatically through to Jira, which is our method for tracking all of our development tasks, our user stories, our test cases, everything. So it's an important way to just help quickly tie everything together. That's why I always feel like the integration point is really important for your tool selection. Then we get to development. So I think I said at the beginning, we use Scrum. We don't necessarily follow it to the letter. I think if you were to ask, I think Scrum is calling for, design and development should be part of the same sprint. We don't necessarily do that. We do follow sprints for designs. We follow sprints for development, but we don't always tie the development and the design sprints together. The reason we do that is because really, it depends on the project, but in this case, the designs were a much shorter period. I think we had 13 weeks, something like that, for the design phase, and much longer time period for development. And we knew that we were going to have quite a lot of designs. We had actually done a lot of work up front before we even got to the point where we started this project, thinking about how we were going to do this and how we were going to approach it. So really it made more sense for us to start with, let's get all the designs out front, understand them well, get them polished, and then we can implement them. And as each of them are available, we put them through that process I mentioned already. We created our user stories as soon as we got the designs locked down, once we got approval on those. Go into your standard sort of Scrum workflow, right? They go into product backlog. In this case, I was acting as the product owner. That's not always the case, right? Usually you're trying to get the client to actually be your product owner. It can be either way, really, but it's in our case, it just happened that we had more time than they did. So, and we understood their problem well enough, and we communicated what we were planning on doing through Confluence, which we'll show in a second. But beyond that, the process is pretty standard from there. We have sprint planning that kicked off at the beginning of each of our development sprints. This says 2 to 4 weeks, but we typically were more 1 week, 2 week sprints, and those fluctuated a little bit, also kind of depending on what we needed to get done in that sprint. We did always have the sprint planning meeting at the beginning, understanding what was it we were trying to accomplish in that sprint. Make sure that we understood what was expected. We have the Jira tasks already outlined so that they're very clear about what we're trying to do. We hold the sessions to understand, make the estimates, make sure we have a very well-balanced sprint so that we understand, how much time is it going to take, how much time is it going to take per person, does this look like it's balanced, are we going to be able to accomplish what we're doing, using the information we learned from the previous sprints so that we can kind of feed back in, right? Put all that in the sprint backlog, do our churn through, everyone's doing their work, we get to the sprint review at the end, make sure we've got everything accomplished that we expected to do using the acceptance criteria we set from the very beginning. We hold our retrospective to learn about what's working well and not working well. Continuous build maybe should be more of an overarching, because really, you'll see in a second how we do this, but it really is continuous in our environment. Every time we check in something to the main development branch, it's going out to our development environment. It's turned into each release as we pump them out. All right, so Confluence. I'm not sure how familiar everyone was with Confluence. It's just a wiki tool. We use it again because it's nicely integrated. Atlassian does a good job with integrating all their tools. So in this case, this is just an example of what we use Confluence for. It's basically everything other than our development tasking. So you can see an example here of a couple of our sprints. We tried to outline what we're expecting to accomplish for each sprint up front. Again, it's Agile, so we can change things as we need to. This is just our way of saying this is what we were expecting to do for these sprints. Hey, client, do you feel like this is going to be a good representation of what you're looking for? Because we align these also to our releases. We didn't do a release every single sprint. You can, you can't. Kind of up to what your needs are for your client. In our case, we did a release maybe every 5th sprint, something like that. But this is a good way of just making sure that we're able to demo. We did a demo at every sprint end, so that they could see the functionality that we were accomplishing and making sure we're getting feedback on that. So we use Confluence for all of our sprint planning. Use it for all of our regular project management, right? So all of the information that needs to go out to the client, any information that we need for ourselves, right? Because we have 2 different development teams. Again, the ones for the optimization engine, and then the team for the front end web application. And so this was, the way we kept track of exactly what that interface needed to be between the 2, right? Because that's critical. We have to make sure that when we're independently developing, that they're going to ultimately work together properly. One good thing about Confluence and Jira, again, is that it's nicely integrated in that you see the Jira reports. I don't have a screenshot for that, but it's nicely integrated in that I can say, if I want to pull up the Sprint 9 details, I can go through all the Jira tasking, that anything that's related to Sprint 9, anything that I've tagged with Sprint 9 can be pulled in here, and I can easily see a status also for everything that's related to that sprint. Which tickets are open, which ones are ready for development, or for QA, which ones are completed and ready to go. So I'm a fan of Confluence and Jira together. You might have other tools that work well too. Here's an example of a sprint board. You're probably familiar with these two. This is just an Agile board that kind of shows you some of our tasking for a sprint that was going on recently. So it's pretty standard. It's a good way to, if you're not using sprint boards, they're actually really handy for making sure we have very clear communication again of what we're accomplishing, what's the current status of everything. I think it's pretty important to enable the developers to be empowered to determine what they're going to work on next. So in this case, we let everything that's in the to-do column is just ready for them to pick up, and they already know what they're on the hook for. We let them determine which ones they're ready to pick up next and then implement. So everyone's got very quick access to the status of it. The good thing about both Jira and Confluence too is that when you're giving the access to the client to see what's going on, they're also immediately aware of what's up, right? And they're able to provide feedback on it. They all have logins. They can say, give us quick feedback about. I ask questions all the time. They'll add a feature. I need XYZ functionality to be added, and we can quickly collaborate on exactly what that's going to look like, or not exactly, but the rough details of it, so that we can estimate it properly. Get it moving through the process. Same thing with Confluence, right? There's a commenting system within Confluence so that you can provide feedback on the sprint details or whatever it might be. So collaborative code reviews. So this is just an example of some code that went in recently, and I think that what we use in our system is is Stash, and again everything's sort of integrated well. I think Stash is also part of Atlassian. I'm not totally sure. Yeah, Stash is Bitbucket server. But everything that we have a developer every time they check in code and they're ready, that passes all the basic testing, right? It has to go through lint, and it has to go through properly build. Once it does, though, they put in their pull request, and they will put in their code. We get to in this case, I put in some comments, but usually it's the tech lead who's responsible for doing a review on the code, making sure that it complies with our coding standards, that's going to be efficient and everything, all that sort of normal stuff. They'll put in feedback on there. We can add tasking in here. Again, it's just I know I'm talking a lot about tools, but I feel like it's really important to be able to, when you're doing Agile, right, you need to be able to have quick access to it. Whatever one's working on, give feedback, provide tasking on it so that you can say, let's fix this, and then I know it's done, and I can move on, and we can integrate it, right? So in this case, I think that works really well. Yeah, so I mean, this is part of the continuous integration. Then what happens is, like I mentioned, developers are working on their branches. We're using Git and Stash. They push in their changes. That automatically will trigger a Jenkins task to determine, it's going to go through all the normal build process. It has some unit test validation to make sure that we're, every time we do a build, all of the unit tests that we have in the system will be re-executed. And so if anything's wrong with those unit tests, we know right away that we have to go fix something, right? Same thing with, I think I mentioned lint. We run a quick lint on it to make sure that there's nothing wrong with the coding standards. If all of that works well, which is hopefully the case, the developer puts in their pull request that triggers something to the technical lead so that they know that they need to go review it. And again, you saw on the last screen, they can provide feedback if something's, typically it's not the case that we need to make a lot of changes at that point, but it's a good check to make sure that there's everything is on board and we're ready to move it in. When that pull request goes in, for us, what that does is it triggers a build again. It merges into our main development branch, and then that change will trigger another build, and it triggers once that build is complete and everything passes again, does the whole same process again. If it passes, it then triggers a deployment into our development environment. Jenkins is good for that. You can, I'm sure again, there's other tools that are out there, but what I like about Jenkins is that it's instant, right? So as soon as, not instant, it's 20 minutes on our build server. But in 20 minutes, I know as soon as that PR went in, because I get an email notification that says this feature just, the code was committed to the development branch. So now I can say, hey, tester, go test this, make sure it's looking good in development with all the other functionality that's going in. And we have really quick turnaround that way, right? So we know right away if something's broken. We know right away when something is integrated in. It also lets you set up additional deployments. So if you want to say, for example, we have 3 different environments. One is for development, one's for QA, one's for our staging. Our staging doesn't typically, doesn't get kicked off with the deploy. Into the main development branch, right? The development branch is for the sprint. QA is on a separate branch. We can say, I'm ready to let QA move on with another load that's ready for their testing. Same thing with the staging environment. That one's ready for when I'm pushing into into a release branch. And so it's nice because it can just let you set it up so that your whatever your process is flexible in that way. And then again, once it's deployed to the development environment, we can do our validation. We can test. We can go through that last step. I don't know if I had on the slide back here, right? Ready for QA. That's our trigger to say, all right, now this thing is ready. It's integrated in. I can do my final testing, and then if it's done, it's done. This is just a quick example. We have all these reports that come out. Automated validation on the lint process. Talk a little bit about unit testing. We use Karma for automated unit testing. This is just, when we ask the developers to commit their code, we ask them to also create unit tests right away that can be, automated through this Karma process. Protractor is another one that we use a little. To be honest, we don't use it fully because it's a little cumbersome to write tests properly for Protractor, but it's actually really powerful if you have developers that are also QA people, because really what it does is it lets you set up expectations within Protractor. You can set up expectations that say, let's look for certain elements on the page. Is the status this? I can make it change different, actually simulate clicks on the screen, that kind of thing. So it's really helpful for that. It's very powerful. It's just a little tricky to use. So it's available. We don't do it a whole lot, I'll be honest. But we do quite a lot of manual testing still. It's not the sexiest, but it does do the job. So we use a plugin in Jira called Zephyr, if anyone's familiar with that. It's actually pretty handy. It lets you do all the things you would do in any other test management system like TFS or something like that. You can write test cases, you write your suites. They call them test cycles. You manage executions per test cycle. You can repeat grab all their test cases and put them in a regression suite like this one is. You can, create special test cases for new releases. It's just like any other testing platform. But the good thing again is that it's all part of Jira, and so it can all be part of. There's a traceability report that's in there. So if your client is asking for that, just because we're Agile doesn't mean we don't have any process, right? So, we still have to verify that we've tested everything that we said that we were going to test, and so all that traceability is baked in because everything is linked to each other. And then finally, we've, like I said, we've spent 2 years so far, I think, on this process. So far, the first schedule that we generated was the 2016-17 NBA schedule. That was, the results that they mentioned in the video. Pretty happy about the fact that the back-to-backs, which they've been working on for years, have been able to come down a little bit further this year, pretty substantially. 4 and 5s was the big one that came down quite a lot. So that was just the first year. We know that we're going to get better. The good thing about having a flexible system like this is that you're able to easily add You're able to add kind of flexible new parameters, new constraints. You can validate different what if scenarios, right? So if the league there's a lot of press lately about things that the league is considering for changing up the schedule process itself. So they're able to do that through a tool like this that would be really difficult for them to do through a manual process. So that is we're working to hopefully improve it again next year. I don't know if I mentioned, but it's not just the NBA, but it's also they have other leagues, women's NBA. They have their development league, and so the women's NBA also. I think this year they used this system. Doing some work with referees, scheduling also. So it's a very highly flexible system, and we worked really hard in the beginning to make sure that the platform we're building was going to be adaptable and flexible in order to support new use cases. So I hope that gives you a quick summary of what we've been up to, but I wanted to open it up to some questions.
So when you were working with them, was the MBA, were they used to the lean or agile method, or was there an education process?
I think that's a good question. I don't know that they had done a lot of projects that way, but they were very open to it. They had, we from the very beginning, we started with a requirement gathering workshop with them to understand, what was it they're looking for, what are the components that need to be in the system. And so a lot of the modules that ultimately were in the application kind of came from that initial workflow. So it's kind of waterfall-y, the fact that we did a requirement gathering workshop. I don't know. But it was helpful in order to establish, what are the users like, what do they need, what are their expectations for the system, in order to just establish a baseline of what they needed. They were very, very quick to adapt to the process. We didn't have any trouble with work. So I don't know if I mentioned in the design phase, but we had like 13 sprints, I think it was, and each of those design sprints were a week or two long. And in each of them, we would do, like on a Tuesday, we would, deliver the current designs, and on a Thursday, we would have a review call, so they give them a couple days to kind of put their feedback in, So we kept that cadence along the way, and they were very okay with, that process the entire way. We did some documentation along the way, to sort of meet certain expectations, right, for security and certain, how we're going to do the deployments, that kind of thing. But we didn't go overboard with documenting everything to the very last T's, and they were fine with that. They just really wanted a system that was going to be performant and ready to go by the time they're ready for the 16-17 schedule, and they were very open to that. So I mean, it can be troubling though. I've had clients before where you're saying you're on board with Agile, but you're not really. And that can be really troubling. It's tough. You got to make sure that you're very clear in the beginning when you're setting up an engagement like that to say, this is what we're going to be doing. Give them some examples, of what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. So, because the documentation thing, I don't know if you guys have done that before with groups that you've worked with, but it can be a real pain. Because people have an expectation, right? I don't know. The government space is really often like that. It's hard to get past, the need for a lot of different documents, and sometimes they really need to be done, so you have to do them, and that's fine. But just having an expectation set up front about what you're going to do, I think is really the key.
So from a process perspective, did you do the design, development, and delivery of a particular story card within a single sprint, or was it spread across multiple sprints? And how long was the duration of the entire project?
Well, the last part's easy to answer first because it's not done. We're always adding new features for them. And I think that'll be going on for a while. I mean, it's just, they have a lot of interesting use cases that they're trying to solve, so we constantly add more features. Each of the design sprints, I think if you're asking, was, so we did designs up front, I think I said, right? So we would have our technical team on board for the designs to make sure that they were understanding what we're trying to accomplish. Can this be done? Giving feedback about different ways of handling it. There was this knob thing for a while in one of the designs that was like, that's not going to be easy to implement, so let's scrap that. So that got rid of that. Yeah, so I think we would do designs up front, make sure that we're clear about what we're doing, and then pretty soon after that, though, we would line up. I think I showed you the sprints, a couple of the sprints that we had content laid out for what we were planning on implementing in the development sprint. Those were because the designs were complete for XYZ functionality, so we're going to plan on implementing that next. So it's like they got continuity of here's what we're designing, here's what we're developing. So if you really wanted to think about it as one long sprint, you kind of could, but we didn't think of it that way because we're much more flexible. I think that it's important to say, I want to accomplish some functionality in the sprint, but it's just maybe not going to be possible. Things it's harder, right? So it's harder than you expected to, and so you need to pull something out, move things around. So we weren't that rigid about it. We were pretty flexible. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I saw in the video that they were talking about getting to zero was like a game for them. How important was that gamification in keeping the teams going and running?
Interesting. It's interesting because the score, I don't even know what the score was. I don't think anyone knows what the score was for the final schedule. It was not zero. It was much, much higher because what happens is, the score was pretty much just a number. It didn't really mean anything really because you're adding new constraints and you're saying, oh, this new constraint is so much more important than the other ones, so I give it a penalty of, 1 million now, or whatever the number was, and it kept going up because they would realize as this process is going through, they say, oh, this schedule has this certain defect. I don't like this, and we didn't talk about this before, so I need to create a new constraint that solves for that. And then the new constraint now becomes the most important thing that you're solving for, even though you didn't really think about it initially. So I think that process was where the most interesting part of the project was understanding, we call it the constraint cocktail. What's the perfect cocktail to give you a 16-17 schedule that is playable, that the teams are going to be happy with, they feel is fair. Fairness was a critical element for this. We don't have a KPI for it, but it was more of a, all of the KPIs were meant to show teams relative value on all of those KPIs so that they felt like they were getting a fair schedule in the end. So I don't know about if I would call it gamification exactly, but there was definitely a collaborative nature in trying to come up with the right constraints that satisfy that. There was some interesting competition though on so the way we built it was that the constraint sets that ultimately drive a schedule, we would allow each user to create however many sets they wanted, and each user could do whatever number of optimizations they wanted to run. So basically they could come up with their own sort of planning to say, well, I think that we should I'm gonna start with these constraints, I'm gonna add my own little constraints that satisfy this other condition and see what happens, right? And like, oh yeah, this is driving us to the right direction. Let's add that constraint to the set that everyone else is running. So there was more of I think that was sort of the game that they were playing. Yeah. I think that was critical for us as well, that this system generated schedules. Every 10 minutes, a schedule is coming back from the optimizer. Whether it's good or bad, it doesn't really matter. I don't think I have a graphic in there. And you saw it in the video probably. There was a little line graph that kind of went up and down. That was the output of the optimizer was being displayed on the schedule, or on the screen, so that you could see, oh yeah, it starts off at 30 million or whatever the score is, and it gets down to 10 million, and so making progress. And I can click on each of those schedules and see, is it really looking like this is a realistic schedule or not? Anyone else? Hi.
You said you were thinking about expanding into the women's NBA. Have you thought about just other sports in general? They all travel.
Interesting question. Yeah, we are working. So NBA is actually already, or WNBA is already supported. That was already always part of what we were planning for this system. So men's, women's, and then the development league is sort of their minor league in basketball. We are working with other leagues now to try to find a, to take the same solution to them. There are interesting changes, differences between leagues that. So I'm going to be honest, I wasn't a big sports person before this project started off. But you learn a lot about the differences between one system isn't going to necessarily satisfy all leagues, right? I didn't show you the schedule grid, but there's a density to the NBA schedule that is part of why it's so hard to solve their problem, which doesn't exist for, let's say, football or other sort of they only play a couple of games per year, and so that density isn't there. So you have to present the results in different ways, right? And the KPIs are different for them. Same thing with baseball, for example. Major League Baseball does you see back-to-backs as an important metric for the NBA, but the baseball people are completely different. They want back-to-backs. They want to play series of games, right? So 4 games in a row is actually really great for them. They prefer that. They want to all be in one location, right? So being flexible to make changes that satisfy each client is important for this kind of system. But I think the goal also is you want to make sure that you're building it in a way that is configurable in the best way you can, reusable in a lot of parts, but being adaptable so that when you're ready, if you need to do something like that for schedule, results or KPI changes or whatever it is going to be, that you build it that way so that you're able to adapt to that when it happens, because it will happen. Good question. Yeah?
Do you have any issues with the virtual scrums that we have people in different locations?
So I don't know if you heard the question about virtual scrums and was that a challenge because everyone's sort of just distributed is the word I want? Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, I guess this is just how we work at KPMG. We're so distributed that if in some cases your client is going to be expecting to work on site, and that's fine. But in this case, we weren't like that. The NBA, to your question, is not really looking to, have us on site. They didn't have time to, babysit us. Like, I don't know, that's maybe not the right word, but you know what I mean? Like, they trust that we were able to do it on our own location, and so we did do that, and that's just a perfect way to do it. For us, we use instant messaging to keep in touch with everyone, obviously email and phone calls and stuff too, but I think really the collaboration tools are the key to a lot of that, to make sure that it's, easy for everyone to understand exactly where everyone's at in the process, quickly able to collaborate on challenges they're hitting. Issues with the API, for example, that came up a lot between the two teams. We need to, I forgot about this, and we need to add this parameter. Can you do that? Sure, no problem. 2 seconds, and you've added it to the spec, and now someone implements it. They throw a task in Jira. You're good to go. So, yeah, I think it was pretty easy, actually. Other questions?
Over here. Thank you for the mic. I would assume that part of the reason, obviously, these results is to report or to show results to the constituency of the NBA, which would be the owners and the fans. How much time do you guys spend on reports or analytics, and how was that prioritized?
Yeah, so analytics is pretty much critical to this process, right? So the team that was doing the optimization, sifting through all these schedules, was also doing the calculation of all those KPIs that were important, because those KPIs, I don't know if we had any constraints in the end that actually, we did back-to-backs for 4 and 5s. What am I talking about? Yeah, we had constraints in the system that needed to evaluate how many of those were in the system, or in the schedule. And so analytics were critical for us to generate those statistics and then display them. So we summarized them for each schedule. We let the user click in, drill in to find out exactly how it might look good for the league average might be a good number, or the minimum maximum is okay. But how does this really look to each individual team? Because really it's again about constraints and coming up with the right cocktail. But you as a person who might be at the NBA for 20 years and working with the teams might know something in your head that you didn't quite get into a constraint about how Portland's going to feel about having to be on the road this much at this part of the season, or how someone's going to feel about having to play really tired at the end of the season when they're expecting to go into playoffs. So these kinds of things are part of what we made sure that we made available to them. We're not the users that had the that expert knowledge, but we did understand that analytics was key, so we put all of that in front of them for the schedule itself and also for each of the team metrics, so that the teams could see as well, how do I stack up? Because again, these are very sophisticated teams. They've got lots of people working on this problem also, and so and sometimes they're not super shy about sharing their feelings about things in the media. So it's important to make sure that they're seeing that their schedule really was looking fair. And I think we got a lot of good press out of it. There's still always going to be feedback that's not great. Things we can do better, and we will do better. But yeah. Any other questions? Do we have time? Got a little bit more time. Do it. Any other questions? Yep. What is it? It's something that we actually built ourselves a couple years ago at KPMG, because what happened was we were doing a lot of things through WebEx, which might be okay now with high quality resolution over screen sharing, but like our designs are meant to be pixel perfect, right? So we're doing it in Photoshop exactly how it's supposed to look, and then WebEx wasn't always translating that quality well, so we needed a tool that would be better at screen sharing, perfect resolution, or the same resolution that we were designing in. We didn't have a great system for managing, like we would use Confluence before to put our designs out there and say, hey, client, give me feedback on this, which is okay, but then you have to have a page per design, or you have to have a whole slew of designs on one page, and then feedback at the bottom that someone has to say, this comment went with what? I don't know. So that was why we built the system, was just to be able to do all of that in one tool. Since then, we've added journey mapping and other functionality, the integration with Jira, things like that, just to make it easier for us to use. So, yeah.
What kind of role did you guys play in determining all the constraints, and which has a larger impact on the overall schedule effectiveness and the success of the schedule and so forth? And what methods did you guys use to determine that?
It's a good question. I personally didn't have a whole lot to do with that. It was more of the people on the optimization side, because they were more, what would actually happen a lot of the times was that the NBA would say, my example of, the road trips, I don't like the crisscross country travel stuff or something like that. So they might say, I don't like this feature of this schedule, can we do something about it? And so the optimization team would say, let's see if we can do something about that. And they would build, their version of it first, before we worried about implementing it in the UI. We wanted to make sure, sort of proof of concept it before we get into the point of bothering to put it in the overall system. And so they would have a lot more insight into what's the right penalty value for a certain constraint or whatever. And really, it's really all just about relativity for those constraints. So getting the numbers correct was important. We put we put in some screens in the application that helps the user to understand the impact of those constraints. So, for example, on the schedule grid, I don't have a screen for that, but the schedule grid has a mechanism to select different overlays, color overlays on it. So you might want to evaluate the home stands versus road trips. How long is someone on the road? Because that can be a problem after a while, right? If I'm on the road for 10 games in a row, I probably don't want to be there. But penalties, to your question, is also another overlay we did on that. So to say, okay, so this game is here, but it also is the reason that we have let's say a 10,000 out of your million score or something like that, is because this game is here, and we couldn't find a way to fix it in this 10-minute run, right? So if we ran longer, maybe we would fix it, but just so you know, this is what it looks like right now, and so we gave them some feedback about that. In other views, we have a penalty distribution view, which just shows them, this is the total score, and this is the score incurred per penalty or per constraint. And so that helps them just quickly see, okay, maybe I've got a whole slew of constraints that are moderately, some low impact penalties, but not really impacting the overall score that much. But then we have this big one that's like, someone just created a constraint with a super high penalty, and they weren't really thinking about the impact of it, let's say. That'll come out really quickly, and then we can say, all right, is this the right penalty for this? just so they can understand, what did I do in my constraint building to affect the schedule that came back, and then is that the right value I want? Is this really the right penalty for this? Because if you think about it, when I'm doing relative constraint values, penalty values for each of these constraints, if I chose a super high value because I really don't want that in my schedule, but oops, I forgot that I created a constraint that's triggering that problem to exist in the first place, right? So if I'm causing it and I'm also trying to penalize because it's there, I need to make sure that I understand that those two constraints are conflicting and fix them.
Who were your stakeholders through this that were doing the testing, and what different classes of stakeholder did you have? And when you had disagreement, which I'm sure you did, amongst your stakeholders, how did that get resolved?
Sure. So, good question. We had, I would say we had IT, right? People in charge of the project itself. The project sponsor was actually the IT team. We had the users, and the users had different groups, I would say. A couple of them, there were several users who were responsible for the game scheduling system, and then there were other users who were responsible for the referee scheduling side, which we didn't talk about, but it's, you gotta come up with a game schedule, and then you schedule the referees for each of those games. These were different teams within the NBA, so we worked with them individually to make sure we understood each of their requirements and implemented them properly. They didn't really have conflicts other than priority, I would say. Right? They didn't have conflicts because there were different parts of the system, right? So I don't, what do I care if that team wants this and this team wants this? But they did care about when they got their features, right? So there was that level of, making sure that the sponsor was aware of those kind of conflicts and helping to resolve them. But it worked out really well, I would say, with this project. I know that doesn't always happen with every project, but those are the kinds of constituents we had. There were also two different user groups, I would say, within the scheduling team. One I would say were people who were really passionate about numbers and coming up with these constraints and understanding the penalty values that were affecting that, and right. So the people who were in the nitty-gritty, and then there were people who were looking at more from the team perspective and saying, all right, well, what's the result of this going to be? What do I expect is going to happen when I get a call from that team about this problem? How do I defend the fact that it's a fair schedule? Because it might not look great on this metric, but hey, look at these other metrics. You're on par. You're looking great. Or we factored in some thing from a prior year or something like that, right? So I'd say that was pretty. Those were the two groups, and they had different user needs, right? So some of them needed to be able to do powerful things like looking at those the comparison of constraints to see how they're really factoring into the schedule. And other ones, they were looking for, their values for, the metrics showing fairness and being able to just quickly communicate all these things to the teams. So I don't have a good answer for a conflict, though. I feel like they were pretty cooperative. I don't know. I think, though, in general, though, if that were to happen, I think having a strong project sponsor who's, able to play the cop, between your users to say, look, we all have needs from the system. This is the reason that we're going to go with this, and we'll delay the other functionality to later. It's not going to not happen. It's not going to happen. It'll happen eventually, but it won't happen in this release. Something like that to help you sort of make sure that everyone feels like their needs are being met, but the priorities of the organization are what they are. What's the workflow for generating a schedule? Yeah, it's all up to the team again. So we're the builders of the tool, but we're not the people who are putting that data in. We enable them, so the workflow at a super high level is, I start the season off, I put in all the, core restrictions on the schedule, so the season start date and end date, and when's my all-star break so nobody can be playing, and things like that are, must-haves for the schedule. Then there's, once you're ready with that, you ask the teams to provide input about their availability for arenas, when's my league going to be coming, whatever. What's their priorities? They have preferences too, right? It's not just like my arena's available. Well, sometimes they are like, my arena's available and I really, really want to play on Christmas or whatever it might be, right? So they all have their preferences. That information is requested from the teams. They provide that feedback. that goes into the scheduling, that's an input to the scheduling problem as well as all the constraints. I think that the process will change a little bit from season to season. So in the beginning, you're creating all these constraints from scratch, right? You don't have anything in there. So that was a long process to get everyone to the point where they're happy with the constraints that are in, they have the right penalties and generating schedules that look pretty good. For the next seasons after that, you can start off with that base, right? So you don't have to redo all of that. But that's really the process. And then they generate schedules and they keep doing this and fine tuning and adding constraints and tweaking things until the point where, they're ready to release it. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of constituents in there that have to agree with, the networks have a voice. The league itself, the commissioner obviously has to sign off on it. So it's really just a lot of getting to that point where it's looking like this is it's a fair schedule. It's not going to be perfect because no schedule, there's just too much going on. It's not going to be possible to satisfy everyone's needs perfectly, but you work until you get to the one that looks like it's fair. How much time do we have? All right, we're out of time. So I want to say thank you all for this discussion. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.